An arrest has now been made in connection with the growing turmoil surrounding the Nolan Wells case. But it is important to understand exactly what this arrest does and does not mean. According to the reporting in the source material, a 33-year-old Illinois man named Edward James Porter was arrested and is facing federal charges over alleged threats against people connected to the Nolan Wells investigation. Investigators reportedly say those threats included threats to murder witnesses and their family members, and even threats against police officers. You're very welcome here. If you want to stay with us as this case unfolds, please subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get back to what happened. And that is where this story takes a disturbing turn. Because Nolan Wells was only 18 years old when he disappeared during a July 4th holiday weekend on Horn Island, Mississippi. His body was found 2 days later, face down in the water. His death remains deeply disputed in the public conversation, with questions continuing about what happened before he entered the water and whether there was more to the story than the official determination of drowning. But now, someone who was apparently not known to have a direct connection to Nolan has been arrested over alleged threats involving people who became part of that public debate. And that raises a very serious question. How did a case that began with an 18-year-old young man failing to return home from a boat trip reach a point where people connected to the investigation are allegedly receiving death threats? If you are new here, you're very welcome. Subscribe if you want to follow this case as the investigation and the public debate continue. Now, let's go back to the beginning of this latest development. The arrest reportedly happened in the west suburban Chicago area in Berwyn, Illinois. The man identified in the reporting was Edward James Porter. According to the NBC5 Investigates report included in the source material, Porter was accused by federal prosecutors of threatening to murder witnesses and their family members. One particularly disturbing allegation was that he threatened to cut up one witness and place the remains inside a suitcase. Those are allegations, and they remain allegations unless proven in court. But federal authorities apparently considered the situation serious enough to become involved. The reporting says Porter was arrested 11 days before the broadcast, and that Berwyn police accompanied federal agents with the Chicago FBI field office apprehension team. According to police records obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, Porter did not resist when he was arrested. He was reportedly scheduled to appear in a Gulfport, Mississippi courtroom on September 3rd. That courtroom appearance matters because it begins a separate legal process surrounding the alleged threats. It does not establish who caused Nolan Wells' death. That distinction is important. The source material describes Nolan's death as unresolved in the public debate, while the medical examiner's ruling cited in the reporting was drowning. At the same time, various commentators and members of the public have questioned that conclusion and have raised theories about possible injuries or what may have happened before Nolan entered the water. Those theories have generated intense arguments online, and apparently, some of those arguments have gone far beyond discussion. The reporting says Porter had a criminal history dating back to 2011, with numerous arrests involving allegations including domestic violence, violations of protection orders, theft, gun violence, assault, and threats. One previous incident involved an allegation that Porter threatened an ex-girlfriend by saying, "I'm going to shoot you." According to the report, a firearm and an Illinois firearm owner's card were taken from him at that time. The charges were later dropped after the alleged victim declined to testify. Again, those earlier allegations are part of his reported criminal record. They are not proof that he committed the new allegations now facing him. But investigators were reportedly looking closely at his communications. According to the source material, federal investigators say there was a trail of cell phone calls from Porter to witnesses in Mississippi, along with IP addresses that investigators linked back to him and the Berwyn apartment where he was living. That detail is significant because it suggests authorities were not relying solely on a verbal accusation. They were reportedly examining digital information and attempting to connect the alleged threats to a specific person and location. And there is another detail that makes this arrest particularly unusual. The reporting says Porter had no known ties to Nolan Wells or to Mississippi, so why would a man living outside Chicago become involved in threatening people connected to a death investigation taking place hundreds of miles away? That question is not answered by the arrest itself. In fact, the source material specifically describes Porter as someone who was accused of inserting himself into the death mystery for reasons that were not publicly explained. And this is where the Nolan Wells story becomes even more complicated. There are already competing narratives surrounding Nolan's death. His family and national civil rights leaders have raised questions about whether his death may have been racially motivated. Other people have publicly argued that there is not enough evidence to establish that a crime occurred at all. Some of the young men who were with Nolan have faced intense public scrutiny. Their families have spoken publicly, attorneys have become involved, interviews have circulated online, fundraising efforts have appeared, and people on opposing sides of the debate have accused one another of spreading misinformation. Now, an arrest has added something else to that already heated environment. The people involved in the case are no longer simply arguing about what happened to Nolan. According to the reporting, authorities are now dealing with alleged threats against witnesses and others connected to the controversy. And that brings us to the question that may matter most as we continue through this story. What exactly caused this man to become involved in the Nolan Wells case in the first place? And what did investigators find in those calls and digital records that led to federal charges? Because the arrest tells us that authorities believe something serious happened, it does not yet tell us why. And it certainly does not answer the central question that has remained since that July weekend. What really happened to Nolan Wells? The arrest of Edward James Porter is disturbing on its own, but it becomes even more complicated when you look at the atmosphere surrounding the Nolan Wells case. By this point, the public discussion had moved far beyond one question about what happened on Horn Island. Different groups were offering very different explanations, and some people were making accusations against the young men who had been with Nolan. That matters because those accusations appear to have consequences in the real world. The source material describes people connected to Nolan's death becoming the targets of threats, while the families of some of the young men involved were also dealing with public pressure. One commentator raised the question of why those young men needed attorneys and why their families were conducting fundraising efforts. But there is an important distinction here. Having an attorney does not establish guilt. Being interviewed does not establish guilt. And being publicly accused does not establish guilt either. In fact, the source material repeatedly points to the absence of publicly established evidence proving that those young men killed Nolan. That is one reason the arguments surrounding this case have become so intense. People are looking at the same unanswered questions and reaching completely different conclusions. Some believe the circumstances deserve a much deeper investigation into the possibility of foul play. Others believe the available evidence points toward an accidental drowning and argue that people are being accused without sufficient evidence. And somewhere in the middle of that argument, threats began appearing. The Porter arrest is therefore significant because it moves the discussion away from speculation on social media and into an actual federal criminal proceeding. According to the reporting, investigators say the alleged threats were not simply vague comments made online. They reportedly involved communications directed toward witnesses in Mississippi. Investigators also reportedly examined phone calls and Internet Protocol addresses, or IP addresses, which they say connected Porter to communications involving people associated with the case. That kind of digital trail can become important in a federal investigation because investigators can compare phone records, account information, timestamps, internet connections, and other records when trying to establish who was behind a communication. But even here, there is something we need to remember. A digital connection does not automatically explain someone's motive. It can potentially show that a communication occurred or help identify where it came from. It does not necessarily tell us why the person made it. And in Porter's case, the public reporting cited in the source material does not fully explain why he allegedly became involved with the Nolan Wells controversy. That remains one of the unanswered questions. Why Nolan? Why those particular witnesses? And why did the situation allegedly become violent enough for federal authorities to step in? Those questions become more difficult when you consider Porter's reported history. The NBC5 report described him as someone with a long record of arrests going back to 2011. The report referenced allegations involving domestic violence, violations of protection orders, theft, assault, gun-related incidents, and threats. Authorities reportedly described him as a threat to safety because of his history and previous statements about shooting people. But again, the legal distinction matters. An arrest record is not the same thing as a conviction record. Some of the earlier charges were reportedly dropped because victims did not testify. So the question before the federal court now is not whether Porter had a troubled past. The question is whether prosecutors can prove the specific allegations they have brought against him. And that is something the court process will have to determine. Meanwhile, the original Nolan Wells investigation remains surrounded by uncertainty. Nolan was 18 when he took a short boat ride with friends during the July 4th holiday weekend. The weather was reportedly brutal, with temperatures and the heat index reaching extreme levels in Mississippi. He did not return home with the group. 2 days later, his body was found face down in the water. The medical examiner's determination, cited in the source material, was drowning. But the case has continued to generate questions about what happened before Nolan entered the water. Those questions became even more heated because of discussions surrounding tissue collected during the examination, including throat and lung tissue, as well as a red substance observed around the back of Nolan's head. Some commentators have interpreted those details as possible signs of trauma. Others have offered different explanations. And this is where careful reporting becomes especially important. The source material itself acknowledges that the available information does not establish exactly what happened. One commentator argued that the medical examiner would have little reason to risk a career or criminal charges by falsifying a finding involving Nolan's death. Another commentator raised questions about whether injuries could have occurred before Nolan entered the water. But those competing arguments are not the same as forensic proof. The public still needs to distinguish between what an expert actually concluded and what someone believes the evidence might mean. That distinction has been getting lost in the noise, and the noise has been enormous. Interviews have circulated online, clips have been taken from longer conversations. People have accused others of lying. Others have accused commentators of protecting certain people or unfairly targeting them. And as the source material shows, even the question of whether an audio recording is authentic has become part of the dispute. Some people have claimed that an audio recording contains sounds suggesting Nolan was in distress, or that people on the boat knew he was already dead. Others have challenged that interpretation. The source material also explains that the full audio or video was not publicly released because other people's voices could be heard in the background, and those individuals were not necessarily involved in Nolan's death. That creates another problem. When the public hears only portions of a recording, people naturally try to fill in the missing pieces. But the missing pieces may be exactly what investigators need to understand the timeline. What was happening immediately before the call? Who was present? Who was speaking? What could actually be heard? And when did the people on the boat realize Nolan was in danger? Those are very different questions from simply asking whether a recording sounds suspicious. And now, there is another layer to the story. The young men who were already facing public accusations have reportedly hired attorneys and, according to the source material, some legal action involving defamation has been discussed. That means the consequences of the public accusations could continue long after the original investigation. Families can be affected, reputations can be affected, witnesses can become frightened, and when threats enter the picture, people who might otherwise be willing to speak publicly may become much less comfortable doing so. That may be one of the most troubling consequences of what is happening around Nolan's case. A young man died. His family wants answers. Other families say their children are being accused without evidence. Commentators are fighting publicly over competing interpretations. And now, federal prosecutors are pursuing allegations that someone threatened people connected to the controversy. The arrest of Edward Porter does not solve the mystery of Nolan Wells, but it does show just how far the fallout from this case has spread. And there is still one crucial piece we have to examine. What do the medical findings, the disputed audio, and the timeline actually tell us about Nolan's final hours? Because once those details are placed side by side, some of the arguments surrounding this case become much easier to understand. There is one thing we have to keep separate as we reach this point in the story. The arrest we have been discussing is real, but it does not answer the central question of how Nolan Wells died. Edward James Porter is facing allegations involving threats. Nolan's death is a separate question, and the available material does not establish that Porter was involved in Nolan's death. That distinction matters because the public conversation has increasingly connected events that may not have the same explanation. So, what do we actually know? We know Nolan was 18 years old when he went out with friends during the July 4th holiday weekend on Horn Island, Mississippi. We know he did not return home with them. We know his body was found in the water 2 days later. And according to the material we are working from, the death was ruled a drowning. Those are the basic facts. Beyond that, there are questions. One of the most heavily debated issues involves what happened before Nolan entered the water. Some commentators have pointed to references involving Nolan's throat tissue and lung tissue, suggesting that investigators may have been looking for signs of trauma or trying to understand exactly what happened before his death. There was also discussion about a red substance around the back of Nolan's head. But the source material makes clear that the meaning of that detail is not established. It could have represented trauma. It could have had another explanation. The available information does not allow us to confidently choose between those possibilities. And that is precisely why the case continues to generate so much debate. The same thing is happening with the disputed audio. Some people have interpreted sounds on an emergency recording as evidence that the people around Nolan knew something had happened to him. Others have questioned whether the recording actually proves anything about when or how Nolan died. That difference is enormous. An audio recording can tell investigators what people said or what sounds were captured. It may help establish a timeline, but interpretation still matters. If someone sounds frightened, that does not automatically tell us why they were frightened. If someone sounds surprised, that does not automatically prove they were innocent. And if someone says something confusing during an emergency, investigators still have to establish what happened independently. This is where the Nolan Wells case needs careful attention. The public wants a simple answer. Was Nolan murdered? Was his death accidental? Did something happen on the boat? Did something happen before he entered the water? But the available material does not provide a final answer to all of those questions, and we should not pretend that it does. What is clear is that the controversy has affected the people surrounding the case. The young men who were with Nolan have faced intense public scrutiny. Some have hired attorneys, some have given interviews. Their families have publicly defended them. And according to the material, there have also been discussions about potential defamation claims involving people who accused them of wrongdoing. That creates an unusual situation. People who may have information about a death are also becoming subjects of public suspicion. Once that happens, every interview becomes important. Every photograph is examined. Every statement is replayed. Every difference in a person's story can become the subject of online debate. And sometimes a difference that looks suspicious may have a perfectly ordinary explanation. Other times, an inconsistency can genuinely deserve investigation. The challenge is determining which is which. That is supposed to be the job of investigators and, where appropriate, the courts. It is not something that can be settled simply by watching a few minutes of a video online. And that brings us back to the arrest. The alleged threats against witnesses may have been fueled by the intense public debate surrounding Nolan's death. But the available material does not establish Porter's motive. We do not know from the source material exactly why he allegedly targeted these individuals. We know investigators reportedly traced communications to him. We know federal authorities became involved. We know he was arrested. And we know he is facing federal charges. That is where the facts currently stand. The rest needs to be established through evidence and the legal process. There is also a larger lesson in what has happened here. When a young person dies, under circumstances that leave a family searching for answers, emotions can become overwhelming. People want someone to blame. They want an explanation. They want the uncertainty to end. But uncertainty is not evidence of guilt. A suspicious circumstance deserves to be examined. A witness statement deserves to be checked. A piece of audio deserves to be authenticated. A forensic finding deserves to be interpreted by qualified professionals. And an accusation deserves evidence. That may sound obvious, but the Nolan Wells controversy shows how quickly those lines can become blurred. One person makes a claim, another person repeats it. A clip appears online. Someone interprets the clip. The interpretation becomes a headline. Then thousands of people begin discussing the interpretation as though it were an established fact. And before long, the original evidence can become almost impossible to separate from the opinions built around it. The Porter arrest is a reminder that these discussions can have consequences beyond the internet. According to the reporting in the source material, someone is now facing federal charges because of alleged threats connected to people involved in this controversy. That is a serious development. But it should not be used to establish something the evidence does not establish. It does not prove Nolan was murdered. It does not prove that the young men who were with Nolan were responsible for his death. And it does not prove that every theory circulating online is false. What it does prove is that the controversy has reached a point where alleged threats have become part of the legal story. And the next important question is whether investigators can provide more clarity about Nolan's final hours. Because that is what Nolan's family ultimately needs. Not another argument online. Not another accusation without evidence. Not another viral clip taken out of context. They need reliable answers about what happened to an 18-year-old who went out with friends on a holiday weekend and never came home. For now, there are still unanswered questions. The arrest gives us one new piece of the larger story, but it does not complete the picture. And until more evidence is made public or established in court, the responsible position is to keep the known facts separate from the theories. What do you think? Does the arrest help clarify the situation surrounding the Nolan Wells case, or does it show just how far the controversy has spiraled beyond the original investigation? If you have been following this case, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments, and subscribe if you want to stay with us as new developments emerge.